I mean, the irony is that the first Christians were all Jews. It's arguable whether Jesus Christ was a Christian. He's my Lord, he's my teacher, my savior, but it's slightly anachronistic to call him Christian because the church came about after his time.
Great proportion of the language is specifically God language, about how do we create a relationship with God, about how do we feel intimacy with God, how do we feel service and responsiveness of God. So I think the answer, I'm not sure if I would self-describe as somebody who loves God, because I think that might be outside of the realms of Jewish language, although we have a prayer every day that we say twice a day, which says, that you should love God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your might. So love is definitely there.
I have the sort of reverse wrestle, which is to really want Christians to understand that God is also a God who calls forth faithful obedience, faithful action, faithful living, right? I'm searching for the right words because Christians aren't always comfortable talking about ethics or life, really, in a way that I admire about in the Jewish world.
Welcome to Really Jewish. If you're back for another listen, bruchim habaim. If you are joining for the first time, it's really nice to have you here. We are Really Jewish. Often I am joined by my co-host Yair Dan. This week I have a special guest who is Nathan Eddy from the Council for Christians and Jews and also a chaplain from Mansfield College in Oxford. He is a good friend over lots of years and I'm excited to bring him to the podcast. Really Jewish is a project where we talk about big topics facing the Jewish community. I think one of the big topics facing Jewish community at the moment is how we interact with other minority communities in Israel and with living in a Christian country, which the UK is, how we interact with other faith communities, particularly the Christian church inside the UK. This is a conversation with Nathan Eddy, who comes from the church, who is a church leader, who is a Christian, and a little bit about how we talk to one another in respectful and kind ways and learn from his experiences and lessons, both in interfaith work and as a Christian leader. So listen along inside Really Jewish, our insider conversation about Jewish community and what is going on inside our Jewish community. I am so delighted to welcome to our Really Jewish podcast, Nathan Eddy, a close friend and colleague from the Council of Christians and Jews, somebody who we've had a relationship now for more than, I would say, 10 years, for the last 10 years, something along those lines. Shared Friday night meals together, shared events together at the Council of Christians and Jews. It's been a real bountiful and wonderful relationship, getting to know you, getting to know your family a little bit. You are co-director for the Council of Christians and Jews. You are a chaplain at Mansfield College, Oxford, a post that you took in just a year ago, and you're a Christian and somebody who has given me valuable insight on some of the workings of the Christian community, some of the story of what it means to be Christian in the UK and beyond in these crazy years that we're living. And thank you for being here on the podcast, Nathan.
Well, thanks for having me, Oliver. And yeah, my youngest fell asleep in your Shabbat table after a Shabbat meal, so I think that counts as being friends. So yeah, I'll take it. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. Sorry, it's only the fact that when you're a colleague with somebody, there's also kind of a crossover, and sometimes in UK culture, friendship is presumptuous. So I just hold him back a tiny bit, as is customary in our cultural setting. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. And I guess in these times, given that you're a person like me who holds multiple roles, like what feels important today in terms of your work?
Yeah, sure. Well, now you introduced me exactly accurately. I'm a co-director at the Council of Christians and Jews, which does Jewish Christian Dialogue in the UK, and it was founded in 1942. And I have a Jewish co-director colleague as well. I'm the Christian counterpart. And that's with half my time, and with another half my time, I'm chaplain at Mansfield College, Oxford, where I also have pastoral duties, and I look at care for other faiths as well, not just the Christian students, but I also lead and organize worship at the chapel, and we have a wonderful choir, and we'll have to get you there as a fly on the wall if you're comfortable with that, Oliver, at some point. So, but yeah, between those two roles, I'm very busy.
To be busy, as we say in our tradition, thank God. Listen, it's in the Christian tradition, which I came into quite close proximity with, actually, particularly in the States when I was studying. There's always a conversation of ministers being called to your tradition. So I guess maybe I'll use that language of like, what called you? What was the calling for you to become a priest, for you to become a minister of religion, and why do you do this work?
No, it's a great question. Yeah, we do use that language of calling to emphasize that it's not just a career choice. nothing wrong. It is partly a career choice. There's nothing wrong, of course, with career choices, but it's a calling of God that ministers, priests feel in their lives. They want to. I wanted to. Well, it's also something I've understood differently as the years have gone past, if I'm honest. But at the moment, I would say it's a decision on my part to listen to God calling me to live in a different way, to not orient myself around my career alone or making money. That's not to criticize anyone else really for that, but just to say, you wouldn't go into ministry or church service and not Jewish communal leadership either. I don't think you wouldn't go into it for the money. You would go into it in my case because I wanted to help others, to listen, to bring people together, to inspire people to live and think differently, and to also, in some sense, to help people recognize the place and the call of God in their lives. It's interesting. I'm aware how different it is for many anyway, who feel called, if to use that term, to the rabbinate. And yeah, anyway, so I'm fascinated by that as well. But in my case, it was genuinely to serve God, to serve the church, to give my life to that. In the midst of our society today, I should probably add, which is what brings me to dialogue with, you know, interfaith dialogue as well. But deepest level is, yeah, to serve God and serve the church.
So interesting. So just to say, as a offload side note, you're very welcome to ask me questions back
Okay. All right. Good.
if you're called to do that. But
Sure.
no, it's interesting because I think there is an aspect of calling in Jewish life, but
Yeah.
we don't necessarily use that language. I think part of my calling to Judaism and Jewish life and Jewish communal life as a rabbi was simply to know more about the tradition and to understand Judaism. I think I've said on this podcast before that I kind of worked in youth work as a youth director for one of our youth movements, and really just left that year of youth leadership with a very strong sense, no idea what the tradition was about. So the attraction of like really steeping myself inside Judaism and Jewish life was compelling, was profound and compelling, and I'm still there trying to work it out.
So let me ask you a question then. Really quickly. With the comment I was alluding to was, I've heard a rabbi tell me once that but this was his impression, that Christians are called to be ministers if they love God, in a nutshell. Whereas for Jews, in his experience, or maybe just for himself, it was because he was called to be rabbi because he loved Judaism, right? So
Mm.
I wonder if that fits you.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Not that you have to choose, but I don't think
Uh,
a Christian would use God language, right?
Yeah, no, I get the setup. I get the setup.
Yeah.
Listen, both of us work in as well. I work with two Christian colleagues currently, normally one Catholic and two Christian colleagues in my chaplaincy role at Canary Wharf. So I often thinking about these questions, and I was thinking about this question in preparation for this podcast, but we are not called to kind of explicitly use God language as a fundamental precept of our relationship with the tradition. So I would definitely say, I would like restate, I came to Judaism because of my interest in Judaism and learning about Judaism, what Judaism is. But I do think internal to that, and a lot of the material that I teach kind of week to week is, for example, Hasidic in nature, which is specifically inside the Jewish spiritualist tradition, where a great proportion of the language is specifically God language, about how do we create a relationship with God, about how do we feel intimacy with God, how do we feel service and responsiveness of God. So I think the answer, I'm not sure if I would self-describe as somebody who loves God, because I'm not I think that might be outside of the realms of Jewish language, although we have a prayer every day that we say twice a day, which says, you should love God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your might. So love is definitely there, but we don't necessarily use that directive language of, I am Jewish because I love God. It's a wild word. That maybe in part because of that reactive aspect of what it is to be Jewish versus what it is to be Jewish today
Yeah.
inside the Christian world. That's kind of part of the differential of our
Yeah.
tradition that we've worked out.
Yeah. I heard someone told me once, in Judaism, you don't have to believe in God, but you have to obey him, which I think it's slightly tongue in cheek, obviously, but maybe you don't have to
No,
love God, but you have to obey him. Yeah, I don't know.
you have to obey God, and you might also have to obey God to believe in God, because that's one of the precepts of
Right.
the Ten Commandments to
Yeah, that's fascinating.
believe in
Yeah.
God. But I mean, it's an interesting kind of circular logic. You have to fulfill these 630 commandments, one of which is to believe in God, but you don't have to believe in God. Anyway, interesting and interesting. I guess one of the primary differences between modern religions, I know Christianity is diverse, as Judaism is also diverse, is that aspect of belief in God being the fundamental part, at least as I understand it, of what Christianity is, whereas Judaism just has a slightly different focus in that respect. And certainly the doing is much more significant than the believing as the starting blocks of Jewish life. So I spend much more time thinking about whether I've davened today, whether I've said prayers today, and how I keep Shabbat, than I necessarily do spend time thinking about my relationship with God. And I do think about my relationship with God in some abstract way, but it's not the primary focus of my Jewish guilt. Let's say the focus of my Jewish life is a lot more about the doing. What's the focus of your Christian life in that respect?
Well, no, so that's a good question. There's a good book out by Shai Helt, I think it is, God is Love.
Mm,
I think that's the title of it. I'll look it up
okay.
and confirm it. But anyway, he's a Jewish rabbi educator in the U.S. And he opens it's basically a book about how the heart of Judaism is God's love. He wants to counter and it's written for a Jewish audience. He uses the anecdote of teaching in a Jewish context and using that language of God's love and having these blank looks come back at him from his Jewish students who are like, that sounds like Christianity, right? And so he's wrestling with that a little bit. And I mention him because I have the sort of reverse wrestle, which is to really want Christians to understand that God is also a God who calls forth faithful obedience, faithful action, faithful living, right? I'm searching for the right words because Christians aren't always comfortable talking about ethics or life, really, in a way that I admire about in the Jewish world. So I guess what does God call of me is certainly to live in a loving way, but I think I'm more comfortable with language that is not quite so touchy-feely, that's maybe more about maybe righteousness with that, although that's also quite churchy or sounds religious. Maybe living in a way that's authentic or engaged with others. Yeah, maybe I'd go for language like that. Oriented around others for a greater good. Don't know. I'm struggling because I mean, my background is in Hebrew Bible, so I'm not a proper theologian or ethicist, and it's not something we've always been the best at as Christians, is helping people talk about what life is about, how to live, what Christian life is.
So it's an area of conversation that we've often jumped into. Listen, that we've often spoken about. The aspect of the topic that we chose for today's session was about mission, and I think interestingly, actually, it's an area that we have spoken about over time, but also perhaps skirted around. I don't know. One of the complexities of Jewish tradition and Jewish relationship with Christianity over the arc of 2,000 years plus of a relationship between Jewish life and Christian life is the aspect of Christianity and outreach to various communities. Sometimes that outreach has been, please come and join us. And sometimes that outreach has been active, aggressive, and sometimes violent conversion of Jewish people over time. Particularly, I'm thinking about the Spanish Inquisition and forced conversions during the medieval period. That's not to lay that all at your door, but it's an interesting question for a Christian leader of today, and certainly somebody who does your work in between Christian and Jewish communities, about how you perceive Christian missionary work as a unit, and then also how you see Christian missionary unit, Christian kind of outreach in relationship to the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think when you propose that as a theme, yeah, I'm certainly up for putting that on the table, and I'm very up for hearing the pain that Christian evangelism has caused Jews. I think any Christian who's aware of the history of the church in Europe in particular has a degree of shame, I think, over the practices of what we have to say were otherwise faithful Christians who may not have even been aware of the pain that they were causing. And I think one caveat is I come from a particular part of the church, which is the Reformed Christian church. And my tradition, which originated in the UK, in England, always privileged what's still called liberty of conscience and the freedom to believe and practice one's faith. That didn't mean they were perfect human beings, but that was carried over into the New World. I'm from the States. I'm American, and I grew up there and came to England 20 years ago. And so some of those civil liberties were enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. And, George Washington wrote an early letter to one of the earliest synagogues in the colonies in Rhode Island. And in this country, it was under reformed, independent leaders who welcomed Jews back into England for the first time since the Middle Ages. That was in the 1640s, 1650s. So there are things I should celebrate about my own tradition and its conception of Jews and Judaism, but as a part of the and that's not to erase any of the shortcomings, of which there are many, and the wider Christian church as well. There's been so much harm done by a sense that Jews need to embrace the gospel, right? And that causes me some pain.
Yeah, and I just for clarity's sake, because we like roasting leaders on really Jewish, but we're definitely not here to have you apologize or even make any kind of amends for all Christian leadership and Christians across the generations. But I just think, as a thought experiment, it's the bit that I am interested in is how you match. Listen, in the Jewish imagination, we have kiruv, which is also critiqued and criticized, which is people going out there
welcoming
of different denominations, but often from more Orthodox communities, and grabbing Jews off the street and teaching them and feeding them and bringing them in, and hopefully with the view that they become more frum, sometimes much more frum, much more religious, and then live like significant and practicing Jewish lives. But at least in the modern period, that's never ever been about converting people who aren't Jewish, and that comes with its own kind of problems to a degree or another. And some of those communities that are doing that kiruv work, that outreach work, totally uninterested in anybody converting. They might be actively opposed to conversion. Yeah. There are corners of our Jewish community that are opposed to conversion. But I'm safely kind of state that across generations there's never been that kind of outreach. Whereas my understanding of Christianity, let's just say for 2026, is that there are still Christians out there who are quite actively interested in people converting to Christianity. So I just wonder if, as a faith leader who's doing, both working in the Christian Jewish sector and working as a chaplain in a prestigious college in the UK, like for you, how do you kind of map that aspect of Christian life, which permits outreach and perhaps encourages outreach, with also a reverence and respect for, your Jewish friend who lives in North London and beyond? Less kind of roasting you for any Christian wrongs across the generations, but also just interested in how you map that in your own life.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the irony is that the first Christians were all Jews. It's arguable whether Jesus Christ was a Christian. He's my Lord. He's my teacher, my savior, but it's slightly anachronistic to call him Christian because the church came about after his time. However, he was Jewish. Paul, all of the apostles, also Jewish. However, within a generation of the Apostle Paul, it was impossible, or maybe not a generation, maybe slightly longer, but it completely flipped and became impossible for a Jewish person to be Jewish as well as accept Jesus as Messiah of Israel. So it suddenly became impossible to observe Torah, to eat kashrut, to wear certain clothing, pray at certain times, as other Jews were doing in the ancient world, as well as be Christian. So that's the irony, is that there wasn't a space left within the Christian imagination for the Jew. And that's the tragedy as well. That wasn't able to be held together. And we can't go back to those times, but that it's important to say that for historical context and just to remember where Christianity arose. But I think more Christians need to be aware of the sensitivities in Judaism around Jewish identity and around becoming Christian as meaning losing one's Jewish identity. So A.J. Heschel, the American rabbi, famously very keen in many ways on dialogue, marched with Martin Luther King, spoke up for the rights of African Americans under Jim Crow, also said that if he'd rather go into the gas chambers at Auschwitz rather than convert to Christianity. So strong was he against conversion, and Christians still need to hear that sentiment within the Jewish world. And those are the stakes as I perceive them amongst many. So in other words, there's a very particular relationship that many Christians don't quite understand, who would in other ways quite rightly seek to share Christian faith and seek to grow the church. I guess your question specifically about me and how I navigate these things, to be a chaplain is not to evangelize. I mean, I guess I would hope that my example of living a Christian life and engaging deeply with scripture and theology, and hopefully that rubs off on students, but I'm not there to grow to evangelize in that way. And in fact, I'm more there as a pastoral support. And in terms of CCJ, maybe I guess I would hope that Jews would see me as a Christian and maybe think again about Christianity and realize it's not something to be afraid of. At least I don't think in the UK Jews need to be afraid of the mainstream church in terms of, I don't believe they would engage with people who wanted to convert them or forcibly, reject their views. I think more likely they'd be plied with tea and cake and find people who are really curious about being Jewish, which probably isn't much more comfortable. But yeah, so that's a very long-winded answer about how I navigate these things, Oliver.
No, I also notice and note that part of the conversation leading up to this was about reverence and respect for religious tradition. Listen, I think both within Judaism, there's like an open question about how much Jews are also respectful and reverent towards church and church groups in the UK and Europe, and specifically like a big whopping symbol of that in recent times, which made lots of press in lots of countries, is the desecration of one cross, one crucifix with Jesus on it in Lebanon. I think important also to raise the way, there's more than one way in which Judaism and Christianity are rubbing up against one another in these times. I think from a Jewish perspective, as a progressive Jewish person, it's very painful to see such things, a desecration of religious object. I kind of understand in the broad sense that perhaps in the Israeli psyche that when you desecrate a cross, you are somehow righting a wrong of yesteryear that it's been done to us, so we do it back to them. But it's, a terrible thing to see, and particularly at times of war. And ultimately, in the largest part of this piece is it's a symbol of the way in which extremism is being let free in lots of parts of our society, and particularly kind of rightist extremist politics inside Israel, which does Israel no favors, and also in the minority communities in Israel also makes life scary and particularly difficult in these times. How do you see that image of cross desecration, and how do you kind of relate to these moments of friction, particularly these times in 2026?
Yeah. Well, thanks for raising that. I think that's brave, frankly, to bring to and self-critical to bring it up. So you're referring to the case. It did get international outrage. It was in April this year. There was an IDF soldier who destroyed a crucifix. A cross is just a cross, right? Crucifix has Christ on it. So it was a Catholic family in Lebanon had this crucifix in their garden. And so the really awful video of the crucifix being hit with a sledgehammer. And to be fair, the IDF acknowledged it, and Netanyahu himself apologized about it. So it's important to say that. And these things, there are armies, these things have happened on all sides in wars at all times. But I mention it because I think from a Christian point of view, from my point of view, I hope that Jews and Christians can, at least in the UK, at least, in my work with my friends, my synagogues nearby, and my friends like you, I want to work and do all I can to reach a situation of parity where there's an equality, where there's a mutuality, where there's, the UK is on paper a Christian nation or has Christian foundation. Certainly it has Christian roots, which I celebrate, but at the end, but we're also a multi-faith, multi-ethnic nation. And you can practice whatever faith you have, you can practice here. And I would fight tooth and nail for a synagogue, for my Jewish friends there to feel safe, as well as for mosques nearby. So I would just really want a world in which there can be parity, and there can then also be self-criticism on the part of Jews, as was the case with that IDF, where there can be a sense that, oh, well, historically, there's been a huge imbalance of power with Christians and Jews. But this is also 2026, and, there's support in the UK from the UK government for the state of Israel. There's support internationally still for that state, even though obviously there's great stress being experienced in Israel and, of course, elsewhere in the Middle East. That there can be a moment of reflection about the balance of power, what it might be like for a Christian minority, whether it's in Lebanon or in Israel or in the West Bank, that Christians are in a minority there. And I think a lot of Christians see that dynamic, and I appreciate why in the Jewish world, why it's harder to speak of that or recognize it. Also why there's sometimes false news around this and sensitivities. But I do think it's important increasingly that we are able to speak of Christians within the Jewish world as well as Jews within a Christian world, as was the case for centuries and centuries. Hopefully we're in a world now where there can be more parity, mutuality, mutual respect. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I would hope listeners listening, Jewish listeners, can hear that, even if it's perhaps challenging. And there's other resources out there as well that can help highlight the experience of some Christians, what we're hearing in the Middle East, in the West Bank, or in Israel. That's not to say it's a universally terrible situation, but there are instances that I think are not what I would hope. Absolutely is one way to put it. That's another conversation perhaps, but I just think it's important to have these brave conversations, right, as Jews and Christians.
It's really interesting. Listen, if Israel wants to continue to be a progressive country and to be part of the family of nations, of specifically democratic nations, part of that has to be freedom of religion. And whilst, like you said, Netanyahu distanced himself from the moment the IDF investigated it, these symbols of moments of religious intolerance and religious violence, even in a war zone, intolerable and difficult, I think, for many people in the Jewish community and in Israel to see. The flip of it is, I think, which is the bit which is never going to get as much press as like the place of Christians in the rest of the Middle East, and how I'm hearing kind of my Israeli aunts and uncles in my virtual what's the word, kind of the Israeli narrative voice in the back of my head, which says, like, let's also bring into the conversation the place of religious diversity in non-democratic countries in the Middle East. I don't think it excuses any of the above, but the bit that's often missed in a conversation about Jerusalem, in a conversation about the West Bank and Israel, and it is some of that diversity that does exist, and some of the kind of the stories which don't make the headlines, which is about diversity in religious cities inside Israel. And I don't think any of that makes up for the moments of extremism, the moments of religious intolerance, the moments when crosses and mosques and synagogues do burn, and Christian worship sites. I don't really know where I'm going there, but there's something just about the quiet moments of religious tolerance, whether it's in a UK context or in an Israel context, which very rarely make news. And that's not in any way to excuse kind of this moment of desecration that you described.
No, for sure. We have to continue to find ways of living out quiet tolerance. And the word tolerance is tricky because I want something more proactive than just tolerating, obviously. But we have to still have a bar, have a minimum, and tolerance is a good word for that.
So let's use that as a springboard to what your vision of your work is
Sure.
in this conversation that we're having.
Well, I guess, I would hope we need to have a minimum, and minimally, there needs to be tolerance. Minimally, Jews need to feel safe in synagogues. Muslims need to feel safe in mosques, as tragically wasn't the case in Edinburgh on Friday. In my work with the Jewish community, I'm very aware of Jewish fears. The events last October in Manchester, more recently in North London, were horrific, and I'm alarmed at the way things seem to be progressing. But we still have to do more than tolerate each other. And for those of us living alongside each other in the mainstream, in addition to being aware of extremists, we also have to just be proactive around affirming, other faiths, or at least, not just tolerating, but wishing happy holidays, whether it's Rosh Hashanah or whether it's, being aware of Passover, which often coincides with Holy Week, but is obviously a very different thing. We have to, as Christians, be aware of those differences and be able to note them, celebrate them, learn from them. So it's not just toleration. We have to make more of an effort. I'm speaking as a Christian, especially to other Christians, but I would hope there would be a Jewish way of phrasing this and an obverse that Jews feel they could join in. We have to, as Christians, especially as majority, we have to make the minority faiths feel welcome. And that's not just tolerance. It's got to be, again, celebration is that's a little twee, but we have to sort of be grateful for this diversity that we still have. We may not have it forever.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The picture that keeps on dropping in my mind is you and me running learning sessions for one of our communities, the Chavorah, together
That
for
was
Yom
great.
Kippur.
Yeah.
Must have been probably more than 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago now. And I forget the topic we were talking about, but I just remember that feeling of real connection and solidarity. And I think actually I feel like what you're describing is actually partly represented in this conversation about like rich and deep conversations between leaders of Christian and Jewish faith, like working out where we sit and where we stand together. The other part that I wanted to mention is also about the anxiety. Like we want something more than tolerance, and I think, and I'm with you there. I think there's a historic anxiety from the Jewish community about engagement and interaction with a Christian faith, partly because you might want to convert us, and actually the richness of the conversation when you kind of suspend that for a moment, and also stand in pride and certainty about about my own sense of faith. I don't have to be threatened by you if I know similar to what you said about Heschel. Like, I know my own mind and I know my own faith. I don't have to then be threatened by you. But the richness of learning that comes when I'm actually able to engage you properly is really exciting, because I get to kind of work out parts of Judaism which have been shaped by Christian life and have been shaped in opposition to some of the moves of the disciples of Jesus 2,000 years ago, and traditions that have come about because of aspects of Christian faith that Jewish faith didn't connect with or agree with. And that can be a really interesting spiritual process. It doesn't have to be a process of threat, but can lead to moments of real insight. And I've definitely learning and talking to you over the years, and actually with other colleagues who I've met and learned from, partly as a result of the work that CCJ has done and our friendship and relationship, has led to profound moments for me. And having a real strong sense of what my Christian colleagues think has been a part of my ministry, my religious life and my religious leadership. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, that, there's always a place for you in the pew on a Sunday, Oliver. No, just kidding. No, I think that's what I would hope. That's what I would hope for my Jewish friends in general, to feel confident. I realize there's a lot to feel terrified of right now, and where maybe this isn't the moment maybe to have a many flowers of dialogue blooming in a utopian way. But I want folks to feel confident and to feel they can talk about things that might feel terrifying, scary to talk about. Israel-Palestine is one, but there's plenty of others. And I want us to feel more confident talking about things that we're afraid of.
So thank you. And I will do this again. Just in terms of ways to wrap up, like, is there one tradition that you're thinking of, one verse, one teaching that you might leave us with? And just encourage you to have a word or two to try and sum up our conversation today.
Gosh. Well, how about, I thought about this. How about the Song of Songs? Can I have the Shir Shirim?
Yeah,
Is that allowed? A whole
It's
8
yours.
chapters?
All 8 chapters.
So yeah. So I'm going to go with that because first of all, it's a book about mutual love and respect between a man and a woman, narrated mostly by the woman. However, Jews and Christians have interpreted it in wildly creative ways, whether about, as you'll be aware, a love story between God and Israel, or between God and the church, or God and Jesus Christ on the Christian side. So I guess I name that because it just shows the power of creativity, the power of Jews and Christians I'm sure influenced by each other as well, to interpret scripture in different ways, to see God in places where God isn't even mentioned, except for one little verse about the flame of Yah at the end of the song. So I'll go with the Song of Songs.
And will you offer us one takeaway from this conversation as we close?
Sure. How about being brave? I appreciate your bravery. And being honest.
Thanks. Listen, I love talking to you. I have over lots of years. And thank you for coming on Really Jewish and sharing a little bit of your wisdom, your teaching, your work. And we hope to have this conversation again sometime soon, and wishing you only good.
Thank you. I'm glad you are really Jewish, Oliver. And I'm delighted to be a guest here, and delighted to wish all your listeners to be confident in their real Jewishness as well. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating conversation with Nathan. Listen, he's a close friend and a colleague, and really what today's episode represents is like a continuation of a conversation that we've had over lots of years. I think the painful part is Christian community worldwide seeing parts of Israeli extremism and extremism against some of the minority faith communities in Israel, particularly represent that desecration of the cross in South Lebanon that he described that happened in April. Listen, my aspirations for life in the UK and Europe is that communities continue to be respectful and reverent for one another, but specifically that we continue to have conversations as a Jewish community with other faith groups. And I think there are ways in which, when we deepen those conversations, have real strong conversations with Muslim community, with Christian community and others, that we get to learn about our own Judaism and about what it is to be really Jewish, and also to have friendship in those times, in those communities, strengthens us. I can say that, since October 7th and over the last few years, that my friendship with Nathan and with other Christian colleagues has helped me negotiate and balance these times, and not just to kind of disappear into a abyss of desolation and real sadness about how the world, not disappear in some kind of malaise and real sadness about how the world is. So that was my conversation with Nathan Eddy. Thank you everybody who's listened to Really Jewish. this week. I hope you got something out of it. Thank you for your support. Thank you to Oiva Voy for the musical intro and outro for this podcast. You can listen to Back to My Roots, available on all streaming platforms, their newest single. We really depend on your support for this podcast. If you've been listening for a few weeks now and you'd like to become one of our regular Patreon supporters, please do that. Sign up and give us £1 a month, £10, £100 a month, and support this work in significant ways. In smaller ways, please like this episode wherever you listen to your podcast, and share our videos on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and offer us comments. We'd really love to hear your feedback about this podcast, things that you push back against, things that you disagree with, and also things that you agree with and have enjoyed. Join us next week for another episode of Really Jewish with Yair Eldan and Oliver Joseph.